Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives on urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton Junior Nolan Musselwhite. I'm joined by President of the podcast, James Cross. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Pinelope Goldberg on the show today. Dr. Pinelope Goldberg is the current Elihu Professor of Economics at Yale University. She's the former Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and 2021 President of the Econometric Society. Her extensive contributions include serving as editor-in-chief of the American Economic Review, vice president of the American Economic Society, among other positions. Professor Goldberg's current research delves into the resurgence of protectionism in the U.S., the intricate relationship between trade, poverty, and inequality, the impact of informality and trade liberalization amidst labor market frictions, and the pervasive issue of discrimination against women in developing countries. Professor Goldberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So we wanted to start off by asking you a bit about your illustrious career and experience, not just as an academic, both here and at some of our rival schools, but also as a policy maker at the World Bank. In 2019, the World Bank's annual report lamented slowing global growth and the unequal distribution of 21st century growth. The 2023 report speaks of a confluence of crises, of geopolitics, debt crises, climate, and the lingering effects of COVID-19. Can you take us back to 2019? What priorities back then have become even more urgent? What from that era has taken a back seat?
When I joined the World Bank, the priority was and has been for several years the reduction of poverty, which is a major issue in parts of the world, especially in Africa and in parts of South Asia. So this remains a priority. But in the meantime, we also have the additional challenge of climate change. And a lot has changed in the last 4 years. Climate change has been an issue for many years, and people have pointed out in the previous decade that one had to take action before the problem became too big to handle. However, what we've seen in the last 3 years is a prioritization of these issues also in the context of developing countries. So that's a big change compared to the time when I joined the World Bank. At the same time, I think the landscape has changed. The world is much more fragmented compared to 2019. In 2019, this process was just starting, and many of us were worried. By now, it's quite clear that we're in a very different world, which poses very challenges for advanced economies, but also many challenges for low-income countries. And, last but not least, we have an explosion of conflict around the world, several military conflicts going on, which have direct implications for poverty. So it's a particularly challenging time.
So I want to jump into that question of fragmentation, and that's something that you've written about quite extensively, international integration and its inverse, fragmentation. Specifically, you recently published a monograph called The Unequal Effects of Globalization. And I want to talk through some of the book's central claims. What are the challenges that some economists and journalists make to the argument that trade policy is a determinative force in the extent of global trade? And why are some of these challenges misguided?
So ironically, many economists, and especially trade economists, have challenged the view that trade policy has been a crucial determinant or a crucial contributor to the explosion of trade, to the explosion of globalization in the previous decades. And so such economists attribute the growth of trade and globalization to technological forces, so mainly to the reduction in trade costs, to the internet, to containers, and so on. And I have to say explicitly, I disagree with this view. I think trade policy has been incredibly important. And by that, I don't mean directly tariffs or trade agreements, but having a stable trade environment where people know what to expect, where people understand the rules. This is very important for trade and investment, and the two are complements. So it's very hard to econometrically, to scientifically prove that it's because of trade policy that trade exploded. But I think there is plenty of very strong suggestive evidence, very strongly suggestive correlations that speak to this very strong effect that trade cooperation, a stable trade environment have had on globalization. At the same time, I think that the trade framework, the World Trade Organization, became to a certain extent victims of their own success. So they grew very fast. They started including countries that are very heterogeneous with very different priorities. So on one hand, you can say it's great that the World Trade Organization extended beyond the advanced countries, compared to what has been once upon a time the GATT, to include low-income countries, to include China and so on. But at the same time, that posed many different challenges because these countries had very different priorities. And one of the biggest challenges, of course, was when China joined in 2001. China was still a lower middle income country. It still faced many challenges. Between 2001 and 2020, China's growth exploded. It became a major economy, the number two economy in the world. And within the world trading system, it's often still treated as a small developing economy. So there's a tension there, because on one hand, there is this formidable economic power called China. On the other hand, the trade rules treat it often as a small developing countries. The United States and other Europeans very often felt this was not unfair. The rules of the game had become unfair, and they were disadvantaging countries like the United States. So at that point, the United States started retreating from this cooperative agreement. So that happened even before 2016. That's not specific to one particular administration. This was a long-term trend. And at the same time, we had an influx of imports from low-wage countries, especially China, into the United States, which I would argue were very good for the consumer, for the American consumer. We saw prices remaining low in the United States. We saw prices of iPhones, of smartphones being extremely low. People enjoyed, even the poor, they enjoyed access to a variety of goods at affordable prices that would have been unimaginable without the extent of trade that we've had. But at the same time, there was enormous pressure on labor markets, on plants, on companies, on workers that were directly displaced by these imports, especially from China. And that created a climate that was very conducive to a backlash against trade, against globalization. So within a few years, we saw the overall sentiment towards trade, towards globalization changing, and then one thing led to another.
Yeah, I wanted to explore some of that backlash and your argument about the origins of it and the distributional effects of trade within a country. One of the things that struck me about your monograph, the Unequal Effects of Globalization, was the elephant graph, which is originally published, I believe, by Deaton, but you have a modified one which includes sort of a disaggregation among the top 1%. Could you explain what the elephant graph shows us and how that might explain some of this political backlash to increasing globalization?
Sure. So actually, the elephant curve, originally the curve came from researchers of the World Bank. So Branko Milanovic and Christoph Lackner. And then actually they didn't have an elephant. It's actually Caroline Freund who added this top part of the curve, the blue part that looks like an elephant. But Angus Deaton, who was actually a colleague of mine at Princeton for many years, has written a great book, The Great Escape, where he makes a similar point. And basically what this curve shows, this is a growth incidence curve. So it shows for different percentiles of the world income distribution what the growth rate has been in the past 3 decades. And what the original elephant curve shows is that the people who benefited most from growth in the past 3 decades were the very poor, if you want, or the people in the middle. And this is the global income distribution. So you pool all people of the world together. So by that metric, the people at the lower tail and in the middle were the world's poor. So they were the people who were living, in China or in Vietnam. East Asia features very prominently in that curve. So what that curve suggests is that the people who benefited the most from growth, from globalization, were the poor of these countries. And there is plenty of evidence to that effect. And that's a point that also Deaton makes, that globalization benefited the poor of the world. It helped lift them out of extreme poverty, either through trade or through immigration. So that's the message of the first elephant curve. At the same time, if you look even at that curve, the people at the right tail of the distribution, so the rich, if you want, by that metric, these are the people in advanced countries. These people still do well. They don't lose in absolute terms, but in relative terms, they do less well than the really poor. Now there is an updated version of that curve. So that curve, the original one, used survey data, so consumer survey data. And the problem with consumer surveys is you ask people about their income, about their consumption, but the very rich are either not interviewed, or even if you manage to include them in the interview, they may not report their income truthfully, or in many cases, the income is top coded. So if your income is 1 billion, it's not going to show up in the survey. So the more recent version of this elephant curve is based on tax data. And the advantage of the tax data is you capture the very top of the income distribution. So as you said before, James, you capture the top 1%. And this is a curve that was created within the World Inequality Report and dissects what happened at the top 1%. It shows essentially that the very, very top of the income distribution, so the top 0.1% actually captured a very high percentage of the growth. So this is very consistent with a message that many people have conveyed in the context of the United States or Europe, that the top 1% has been leaping ahead in the last few decades. But still, at the same time, if you look at this curve, you see that the people at the bottom, at the left tail, have done very well. But in that curve, it's the middle that's really squeezed. And the middle, it's a different scale in that curve. The middle corresponds to the middle class in advanced countries, to the middle class in Europe or in the United States. So again, in relative terms, these people are doing less well than the people at the tails. And this is consistent also with other work, for example, on labor markets in the US, that documents this phenomenon of polarization. So the poles are doing well, but the middle gets squeezed. So all this, growth, that came at the same time that globalization took off, seems to have benefited the tails of the distribution, the very poor and the very rich, but it has squeezed the middle class. And that created, again, a climate that was very ripe for a change.
Yeah, and Professor Goldberg, I wanted to ask about that bottom half of the curve, if you will, because this was an argument that you made in your keynote at the Griswold Center, and several other speakers made too, highlighting that the benefits derived from globalization have, to a great extent, fallen on that bottom half of the curve. But I was also struck by where that development was happening, and it was overwhelmingly Asia. I think within Asia, specifically overwhelmingly China. So one thing I was wondering, is it more accurate to see this development phenomenon as the economic development of China, specifically, and the benefits accrued to China from the trade regime, or is it accurate, truthfully, to say that it's a global development phenomenon?
So China is very important simply because it has 1.6 billion people. But so when we talk about world poverty, if you manage to get the Chinese out of extreme poverty, that's going to be a big change in the numbers. But the experience was not unique to China. The same experience was documented for several Asian countries, including Vietnam. Korea is another example. The very small countries, Singapore, Taiwan, more recently, Malaysia, Thailand, all these countries benefited. Also, countries in Eastern Europe, so the countries that used to be part of the Eastern Bloc before the Berlin Wall fell, all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, the growth in these countries also took off. And it was partly because they were integrated in the world trading system. So it's not unique to Asia, though I agree that Asia is a big part of it. The big failure that still is very troubling is Africa. So Africa has been the one continent that was left behind. Now, I would argue also Africa is the one continent that's not connected. It's not connected to world markets. And it's also within Africa, countries are not connected to each other. So if you want to go from one African capital to another, in many cases, you have to go through Paris. If you are in one country, let's say like Nigeria, and you want to transport goods from the ports to, to the center of the country, it may take weeks. That there have been cases where it took months, 6 months to transport these goods. So the connectivity costs in that continent are enormous. Now, this is not the only problem in Africa. There are huge other issues. There are institutional problems, there are political problems, there's still violence. The human capital is low, so I'm not claiming that this is the only reason that Africa was left behind, but still the correlation is striking. Africa is the one country that's not participating in global value chains in the world trading system. It's the one continent that is left behind. So again, to come back to your question, it's not just Asia, but I would agree that Asia took off. Another interesting case is what happened in Latin America. And Latin America is different because the countries there by now are all middle-income countries. So we're not talking about extreme poverty the way we still see it in Africa. But so many of these countries opened up, but in a very different way than Asia. Like in many cases, they engage in this import. So in this import substituting strategy, so they try to protect their domestic markets. And very often these strategies proved detrimental to growth. So Latin America is another case where this story of globalization doesn't always go through.
Speaking of Latin America, I wanted to mention I spent the summer in Colombia, so it has a special place in my heart. And I saw that you wrote an article a few years back about Colombian trade reforms and what that sort of natural experiment in their attempt to meet WTO standards, what that might show us about the way that reducing tariffs is going to impact global trade. Is there any way you could mention a little bit about what the upshot of that paper was, and maybe if it reflects the experience of Latin America more generally?
Yes. So what happened in Colombia is back, in the early 90s, when Colombia joined the World Trade Organization. A condition of joining the World Trade Organization was that they reduce the tariffs across all sectors, and they would reduce them to a uniform level. And now, from a research point of view, this is a very interesting natural experiment in the data, as we call it, to investigate the effects of protection on various outcomes. The reason is most of the time, changes in trade policy are endogenous to domestic conditions, right? So you have lobbies that lobby for protection. And so you may see higher tariff reductions in sectors that are not represented by lobbies, or in cases where there is no domestic opposition to tariff reductions. In Colombia, that was not the case, simply because it was a condition by the World Trade Organization to reduce all tariffs to a uniform level. So we exploited this experiment to see what happens. And at that time, when I wrote these papers, actually I wrote all these papers with my long-term co-author, Nina Pauchinek, who was a graduate student at Princeton. So all this work actually came from my time at Princeton. What we were interested in at the time was to explore the effect of these trade liberalizations on inequality in Colombia, on wage dispersion, and see if the sectors, the workers that experienced higher tariff reductions experienced also higher wage reductions. And what we found was essentially a statistically significant effect, but the effect was not economically significant. So what I mean by that is we did find that sectors in which the tariffs were reduced by more experienced more import competition from other countries, so that the wages of the workers in these sectors were squeezed relative to the wages of other workers. So that effect went in the direction of suggesting that trade liberalization was increasing wage inequality in Colombia. But if you looked at the magnitudes were too small to explain the change in inequality in Colombia. And this is part of a greater research agenda that looked at what happened in developing countries. At that time, it exploited many similar experiments where countries were reducing tariff protection to see how the inequality was affected. And the general conclusion from all this work, not just for Latin America, but worldwide, was that trade had a very small and negligible impact on wage inequality. So yes, inequality was increasing, but for reasons that had very little to do with trade liberalization. And the main suspect at the time was technology, of course, skill bias, technological change. And as I mentioned, actually, in the book, all this consensus changed around the year 2000. And one question is why? So the obvious answer is it's because of China. Because in 2001, China enters the World Trade Organization. It's a huge country. It matters. So it's one thing to importing goods from a small country, relatively small country, let's say Mexico. It's another thing to be importing products from China, a country with 1.6 billion people. So this is one view, that this is all because of China. My personal view is that China did play a role, but perhaps what's more important is that we started focusing on a different dimension of inequality. So rather than focusing on differences in wages across workers with different skills or across different sectors, we just started focusing on places, on comparing regions, places that had different exposure to import competition. And that made a huge difference in the conclusions. So it's a different dimension of inequality, if you want.
And I wanted to touch on that issue of inequality, and specifically, back in 2018, so the vast majority of economists, you wrote in a recent article, I think for the Japan Times, the vast majority of economists, when polled, responded that Trump's new tariffs in 2018 were a bad idea. Trade is good for the world on the whole. It may have costs in the short term, but in the long term, it's the right decision to increase free trade globally. Those same economists were polled more recently after the pandemic-induced supply chain issues, and with the Biden administration keeping many of these tariffs in place. And you were one of the few economists who argued for free trade in both polls. Could you sort of explain why you think this change has happened, even among academic economists, and why you're still against these tariffs and you have faith in global value chains?
Yes, so this poll that you mentioned, to me, it's the best indication that the sentiment has changed dramatically. And by the way, in the second poll, I was not one of the few, I was one of the two economists who had a dissenting view on the issue. Now, the questions were phrased differently. So in the first case, it was about tariffs. And as you mentioned, there was uniform agreement that tariffs are a bad idea. In the second case, the question was not specifically about tariffs, it was about global value chains. And there was this view that global value chains have become a liability. So I strongly disagree with that. And for two reasons. The first is that there is no evidence that during COVID, and that was a very challenging time for all of us, there is no evidence that trade and global value chains contributed to the fragility of the economies. I would actually double down on this and say that thanks to global value chains and trade, we came off better than in the counterfactual case where we wouldn't have trade. I'm not claiming that there were no disruptions. Of course, there were disruptions, but they have to be judged against the magnitude of the shock that we have experienced. We experienced a major shock, arguably the biggest shock since World War II. There was no way there wouldn't be disruptions. And the disruptions we experienced were severe, but still manageable. We managed to come out of these. At least in economic terms, I'm not talking here about the loss of life, the loss of health. But yes, for 1 year, GDP went down, trade went down, but after a year, most economies bounced back. Of course, it was not just because of trade; it's also because countries, pumped money into the economy. But what's really remarkable is that during that time, that extremely challenging time where we had lockdowns all over the world, we still had trade between countries. We still exchanged goods, and that because of that, we managed to get through. To give you some specific examples, take the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. So as the CEO pointed out, to produce the vaccine, you need 280 ingredients, and these 280 ingredients come from 19 different countries. So this is a case of an incredible global value chain. So it would not have been possible to produce this vaccine if at this incredibly challenging time, right, where we had all these lockdowns, you still had 19 countries cooperating to ship these ingredients back and forth. So this is a quite amazing feat if you think about it. Think of face masks. This is another of my favorite examples. So yes, we experienced the shortage of face masks for 2 weeks in the United States. And then what happened is China was coming out of the first wave of COVID. And so it had a surplus of masks. So it started exporting masks to the United States and to the rest of the world. So actually, thanks to trade in face masks with China, we had access to face masks when we needed the most. And face masks is one product where we rely excessively on China for our consumption. So 80% of the imports come from one country, from China. So this is again a case where if I look just at the facts, this is a case where trade with China helped us. Now, it's very natural. I think the valid argument, the valid point that came out during that time is that we still need to start thinking about risk, right? Because up to that point, no one had given serious thought to the question of risks. So in that particular case, things turned out nicely, and China managed to send us face masks, and that was wonderful. But you can imagine a different type of shock, so different circumstances where things might have played out differently. And so one example is semiconductor chips. Again, we had a semiconductor chip shortage. Partly, there are many reasons for that, but one reason is advanced semiconductor chips are produced by one company, TSMC, in Taiwan. It's just one company. When this company went into lockdown for health reasons, the world stopped having access to chips. So that at that time had nothing to do with geopolitics or with a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The problem was that if you have concentration of production in one firm, in one country, you are very vulnerable. And up to that point, we had not quite appreciated that point. So I think that's valid, and it's worth thinking about that. But beyond that, going to the extreme and saying that global value chains are a liability, I think there was no support for that at all.
Yeah, and I think moving forward, you've noted that there has been a marked change in sentiment, as reflected by this poll, and also as reflected by policy and a lot of these tariffs that the Trump administration put on, that the Biden administration is keeping on. I have one question there to start out, which is that a lot of your most recent research has focused on the 2018 to 19 trade war and these tariffs, and specifically their effect on bystander countries. What were some of the interesting findings that you had coming out of that, and the sort of net trade opportunities that a lot of the rest of the world had as a response to this trade tension?
That's a very interesting question, because at first it seems that what happened pretty much contradicts what I've been saying in other contexts, namely that trade wars are really detrimental to growth and welfare. But what happened in the trade war between the US and China, it benefited other countries in terms of exports. So it's true that direct trade between the US and China plummeted. The two countries started trading less with each other. But as you would expect, other countries fill the void. So for example, Vietnam, Malaysia, but also countries in Europe, the Czech Republic, Romania, they started exporting more to the US. So this is something that you would have expected. What was less expected and surprising is that these countries started exporting more also to the rest of the world. So it was not just the trade with the US that took off. They started exporting more to other parts of the world. And this is not intuitive, because you might have thought that they divert their trade from other countries to the US, right? So they export less, let's say, to Germany, and they start exporting more to the US, or the Vietnam exports less to the European Union, and they divert their exports to the United States because they see an opportunity there. What we documented in our work is that they export more to the US, Vietnam in particular, they export more to the US, but they also export more to the European Union. They export more everywhere. And as a result, trade in those products that were hit hardest by the tariffs, trade grew. That's very counterintuitive, but it suggests that there may be some type of economies of scale. So countries start producing more to export more to the US. And in the process, they perhaps there are economies of scale, or perhaps there are inventories, or perhaps they make investments that were long overdue. We don't know exactly what the reason is, but for whatever reason, they start exporting more to the rest of the world. Another hypothesis is that there is major reallocation of global value chains, and that's why all this is happening. So, one person gave me the following example. Suppose China wants to divert its exports and go through Vietnam to reach the United States. So now production is moving to Vietnam, or to Malaysia, right? But there are other products that are produced in these countries, so there may not be enough capacity to take on these new orders that are coming thanks to the trade war. So what do you do then? Then you move some parts of the production that used to happen in Vietnam or Malaysia, you move them to other countries, let's say the Czech Republic or Romania, some other parts of the world, and you reallocate global value chains in complex ways that you cannot immediately, that you wouldn't immediately have expected. And as a result of this reallocation, you see many countries benefiting. When I say benefiting, I always mean in terms of exports. You see many countries benefiting from this trade war. So there is a view out there that says maybe what's happening, mostly in the United States, between the United States and China, maybe this will have some positive effects on third countries or on the rest of the world. I'm a little skeptical about that, but the fact is, so far, in terms of exports, there are countries that have benefited.
Thank you, Professor. And speaking of that U.S.-China rivalry, I wanted to ask what you view is, if you had to forecast the continued effects of long-term trade tensions. At the end of that Japan Times article, you make this eerie comparison to the conditions in Europe leading up to World War II with respect to trade and the increasing geopolitical conflict now with the U.S. and China. So what lessons or what directives would you give to policymakers with that experience in mind? And at the same time, what do you view as the likely reality if these trade tensions continue? I mean, it doesn't seem like they're going away. If anything, they're increasing as restrictions shift to higher technology goods. So what do you forecast as some of the effects of the geopolitical tension for the U.S. and China? And what directives would you give to policymakers who are trying to balance national security and economic development?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me start by saying that I'm a big believer in peace. And I think all these trade tensions and the trade wars and the restrictions have an economic cost. They're going to have a cost on efficiency, but I think it's a manageable cost. And I'm sympathetic to the argument that perhaps we should be willing to pay this cost, in exchange for having a better sense of national security, or in the name of environmental protection. There are many other goals that governments pursue these days, and I'm sympathetic to this point. But I think the biggest cost may be in terms of the political cost, that these tensions contribute to increasing conflict, increasing fragmentation. And I know better than to claim that there is a simple causal relationship from trade wars or from economic wars or cold wars to hot wars. I think the world is much more complex. But historically, we see these correlations where you have a period of trade conflict going hand in hand with deterioration of international relations, political relations, and eventually major wars. So the parallel you mentioned about the interwar period in Britain, I think, is very interesting, because what happened during that time, this is the interwar period in Great Britain. Britain engaged in a protectionist policy, very similar to what the United States has been doing. But the former colonies of the British Empire, or the colonies of the British Empire and the various dominions, were sheltered from this trade protection. So as a result, trade between the British Empire and the rest of the world plummeted, just as trade between the US and China is plummeting, but trade within the British Empire still flourished. So trade was diverted. It took a very different form. So you might argue, just as many people do today, so what's the big deal? We have a small efficiency loss because now the British Empire is not trading with the rest of the world, but there is still ample trade within the British Empire. What economic historians have argued is that all this led to a deterioration of relationships between countries, especially as many countries were scrambling to get access to natural resources, to raw materials, the scramble for Africa, it led to increasing tensions. Again, we see a little bit of that now because with the green transition, as an example, we need access to rare earths, to rare minerals. The country that is richest in this earth, in these rare earths, is actually China. There are other countries that have these rare earths too, but they're extremely costly to extract. It's an extremely dirty process. So right now, at least in the short run, it's China that has access to all these resources. So you may worry, even if we manage to get away from oil, from fossil fuels, right, and we manage to become more resilient towards Russia or the Middle East. This still doesn't guarantee resilience towards China because China still has access to rare earths. So that all these relationships are very complicated. And once again, they suggest there are huge gains from cooperation, from keeping the world in balance and in peace. Once you start taking pieces out of this peaceful equilibrium, you don't know where you're going to get. And again, I'm not claiming this is a causal relationship, but we've seen a deterioration of relationships in many parts of the world in the last few years. We see a rise in conflict. We have Ukraine. We have the conflict in the Middle East. And I'm not saying that all this is happening because of the trade war, but I am concerned that through our trade policies, for example, we are pushing certain countries, Russia, China, and Iran, towards each other. We are pushing them towards an alliance that may be a very dangerous alliance in the long run against the other bloc, the Western Hemisphere. So we are moving towards an equilibrium that I think is very worrisome.
Yeah, and we're sort of running low on time, so I want to touch on one semi-distinct topic and pivot a little bit. But some of your work in 2021 focused on a threshold market size for sustained poverty alleviation. And you note 3 ways of doing that: of increasing domestic demand, more international integration, or domestic redistribution. Could you talk a little bit about what the significance of this threshold that you propose is, and what the imperatives for international integration are, especially now that we see fragmentation? Sort of what lesson does this research give policymakers, both in the US and the developed world, but also in developing countries?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. So let me mention, so this is joint work with Tristan Reed, who's at the World Bank. And I started working on this project when I was at the World Bank. And the question we asked ourselves back then, that was in 2018, 19, was why is India growing so fast? So as you mentioned before, China, East Asia, they participate in the world trading system, but India was never an exporting power. So where did growth in India come from? And one plausible answer is India is a huge country. It's a very large country. So it can rely on its domestic market size to grow. There are domestic economies of scale that it can exploit. If it has the right policies, it can rely on its own people. It needs trade less than other countries. On the other hand, if you're a small country, if you're Singapore, take the extreme case, if you're Singapore or Taiwan or Belgium, then without trade, you cannot exist. So we didn't write this paper as a paper on trade. Basically, we asked the question, how big does a country need to be in order not to worry about trade and trade tensions and trade relations? And at the time when all these trade tensions between the US and China started to emerge, and countries started focusing more on their domestic economies, we were interested in asking the question, at what size, what's the threshold above which countries don't have to worry about all this? And it turns out this threshold is extremely high. So the short answer is that the only countries that don't need to worry about trade are India and China, because they are very large in terms of population. And even these countries can grow faster if they are integrated in the world trading system. But if they were not integrated, they would still manage. Now, below this threshold, it becomes hard because we just don't have enough people for this to support industries or sectors that have economies of scale, and these economies of scale are crucial for development. So what do you do in this case? What do you do in the current environment where there seems to be less interest in trade? So, what's crucial for our argument is that your own market, your own population has purchasing power. They have enough power to actually buy goods. So from that point of view, what matters is not how many people you have in the economy, is how much money they have to buy goods. So in that spirit, an alternative to international integration is a more equal distribution of resources within a country. And by that, I don't mean we don't mean complete equality. So you can imagine a country that's very poor and completely equal, and that country stagnates because everyone has the same money, but this is $1, per person, and the economy never takes off. But suppose you have an economy, let's say like Nigeria, or to give another example of a success story, Norway, which used to be a very poor country, and then you have a positive shock. Let's say you discover oil. You all of a sudden, you won the lottery. You have a lot of money in the economy. In such an economy, if you have a more equitable distribution of resources, then this money is shared by the population. You build a middle class. It's an argument in favor of a strong middle class. This middle class has purchasing power, and that can jumpstart the process of development. So in that sense, you can think of having a large middle class, having a more equitable distribution of resources as being an alternative to international integration.
So, Professor, we focused a lot on some of the risks and the pitfalls that might lie ahead in global trade. I wanted to ask about the flip side. So you were chief economist of the World Bank for several years. What is one experience you had, whether witnessing a program's success, seeing your insights in action, et cetera, that gave you hope about the path of global development?
The World Bank is full actually of hopeful stories. I think one country as a whole that provides a lot of reasons for optimism is the experience of Vietnam, where I'm not unique in my evaluation of Vietnam. Many people would say the same, I think, in many of these international institutions. But this is a country that, by implementing the right reforms, managed to eliminate extreme poverty extremely fast and grow very fast. And again, as a chief economist of the World Bank, this is one of the cases where you felt that the World Bank played a very important and positive role in this case. So I remember traveling to Vietnam, and many policymakers in Vietnam at the time were very clear. We are trying to grow this country. We are trying to move from a lower middle income country to a high income country. But there are many things we don't know how to do. We don't know how to develop capital markets. We come from a completely different economic system. No, we want to make sure that there is gender equality, but we don't know what it takes. Give us some advice how to do it. And they sit side by side with World Bank officials, and they craft laws together. Now, they won't always do what the World Bank says, because there are many constraints. There are political constraints. They know their setting and their institutions much better, but they do take the advice very seriously. And again, as an economist coming from the United States or from another country, you feel that you really contribute there because you bring your own insights, and you really help them develop good policies. So I think there are actually, I hope there are other cases that very much like Vietnam, where this cooperation with the US and with the West can be helpful.
Yeah, I remember visiting Vietnam and being just so struck by sort of the level of development there. I wanted to pivot as sort of a final question, one of the more important ones we've asked today, which is that you've taught at both Princeton and Yale. And I'm curious, what do you miss about teaching here, the more charming and beautiful Ivy League school?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I actually have a lot of affection for both places. I mean, there were personal reasons that made me move from Princeton to Yale, but I think I have very pleasant memories. My kids were born in Princeton. I've had many wonderful colleagues. I still have many students from Princeton. I collaborated with them. So I would say I would miss the people, but thanks to the academic network, we keep in touch. But I think more than the buildings and the charming town, a university is about the people. It was really about my colleagues and the students.
Well, yeah, that's good to hear. Also, of course, the Griswold Conference brings minds together from across the Ivy League and the world. So, and that's how we got connected with you. So, of course,
you know what? I often give academia as an example of healthy competition and collaboration. I mean, we compete, universities, we all want to attract the best students and the best professors and place our students. But we also have a lot of respect for each other, and we are friends, and we collaborate. And I think in that regard, academia could be a model for the world.
Right. Hopefully, we can minimize trade tension between Princeton and Yale moving forward. And so we like to end every interview. The name of this podcast is Policy Punchline. We like to end every interview by asking our guest, what is one punchline you would leave our listeners with? It could be about careers in academia and economics. It could be about global development. What would you say as one final thought?
Openness, whether it's in the form of trade or immigration, has done a lot of good things for the world, and especially for the underprivileged. So we live at a time where we see a huge backlash against openness, both against immigration and against trade. And I would encourage, especially the young people, before they go out and they demonstrate and they form strong opinions, in many cases motivated by very noble causes, to actually read a little bit the evidence, the history of how countries have developed. And when you do that, you come away with enormous appreciation for what openness has done for the world.
Thank you so much, Professor Goldberg. It's been a pleasure. To all our listeners, we'll see you next time on Policy Punchline.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.